Yesterday I gave you some. Gave you some introduction and basics of signal transduction mechanisms in the cells, and hope to prepare a foundation for you to understand how extracellular stimuli act on the cells. So most of the stimuli are basically cytokines and neurotransmitters and hormones. So now you have a understanding of the signal transduction through membrane receptors and nuclear receptors. So today I'll touch upon mostly on the endocrine system. So this system is a very important physiological system in our body, which helps to tell the cells what to do and what not to do. So what is endocrine system? So the endocrine system includes endocrine glands and their hormones. The function of the endocrine system is to secrete hormones into bloodstream, and these hormones are basically chemical messengers which target a specific group of cells in order to cause that group of cells to do some activity or stop doing it activity in a cell. So that's how our body is regulated. So these hormones are basically meant to control the action of different part of the body, different tissues, and so as to produce a coordinated response in an organism. So why they are called endocrine, or why these organs which secrete these hormones are called endocrine glands? So there are two types of glands. The first is the exocrine glands, which secrete their products directly into the ducts or tubes. For example, liver secretes bile which in the gallbladder through a duct, and then it goes through a duct into the small intestine. Similarly, pancreas, which act both as an exocrine and an endocrine organ, its exocrine secretion of pancreatic juice during digestion is through small intestine via duct. Now, endocrine glands are also known as ductless glands. So they don't have specialized duct to secrete their compounds, with the chemicals which they make, or the hormones which they make. So what they do is that they directly open the secretion into the bloodstream. So the blood transports hormone throughout the body, and each hormone acts on a certain kind of tissue called its target tissue. So how the cell knows whether a certain hormone is affecting its function? So how the responsiveness comes? So this comes through specific receptors to hormones. So each hormone acts on a certain kind of tissue, which is a target tissue, and in that target tissue, the cells which are meant to be responsive to that hormone express a hormone sensitive sensitive receptor. So it's a target receptor which only binds to a specific hormone, and the cells which do not express those receptors are not responsive to the hormone. So that is how the hormone signaling happens. Now, what are the major endocrine glands in our body? So this we have been studying since I think our high school, that what are the different endocrine organs. So these are the list of the classical endocrine hormones. So first is the pituitary, then the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, pancreas, and the sex organs of endocrine nature, which are the testes and the ovaries. So I'll go one by one, and mostly I'll touch upon the major ones, the major classical endocrine hormones. So first is the master regulator, which is the pituitary. Now, why this is an important endocrine gland? Because it in turn regulates all the other subordinate endocrine glands. So the pituitary is the one which will tell a thyroid to make thyroid hormone, which will tell testes and ovaries to make sex hormones, and also tell other endocrine glands to secrete their product. So it is a small, is a pea-sized organ in brain, and it secretes different 9 different type of hormones which affect many different areas of the body. So the processes which are affected by pituitary secretions are growth, blood pressure, regulation of pregnancy, breast milk production, sex organ function in male and females, thyroid gland function, metabolism, water regulation, and temperature regulation. These are some of the few pituitary hormones and how they affect our physiology. So growth hormone is a peptide hormone which is meant to increase the body size during childhood and adolescence. So it is a very important hormone for our bones to grow so that we achieve a certain height. And similarly, thyroid stimulating hormone TSH. Many of you or in your family, you go for a test for thyroid. So generally, you go for a TSH test. So that's how the doctors tell you whether your thyroid function is right or not. So this thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH is produced by by the pituitary. And similarly, another hormone, pituitary hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, which regulate puberty development and reproductive process. And finally, luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of other two hormones in the sex organs, which are the estrogen and testosterone. So why growth hormone is important could be understood by the pics here. So you see, if there is a over secretion of growth hormone, it causes gigantism. So you can see here this. I'll show you. Yeah. So this is an example of over secreted growth hormone during childhood. So you grow very tall, and and when you have under secretion of growth hormone, it results in dwarfism in childhood. So this is an example of a dwarf. So in these people, there was a derangement in the production or secretion of growth hormone by the pituitary. Now we come to the other important hormone, which is the thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is located in the neck and release the hormone thyroxine. And its function is to regulate the basal metabolic rate in our body and also affect the metabolism of carbohydrate and fat. So over secretion of thyroid causes hyperthyroidism. So thyroxine is basically it's basically a amino acid which is iodinated at different tyrosine places. So it's called T4 because it's iodinated at 4 different places, and it is converted into active form which is called T3. So one iodine is removed, and then this hormone can bind to its receptor and cause changes in gene expression. So over secretion of thyroxine causes nervousness and weight loss. This is a classical hyperthyroid condition, whereas the under secretion of thyroxine results in cretinism. So this is an important thing because our department in endocrinology and PGI had a long history in working on hypothyroidism induced brain derangement. So you must have heard of conditions like in the hilly areas, and especially in the Gonda region of UP, there is a marked deficiency of iodine. So the salt generally we take is not iodinated. So when the pregnant ladies consume the salt which is not iodinated, it affects the thyroid hormone synthesis during pregnancy. And this is one of the most crucial phase where because the offspring's thyroid has not developed yet in utero, so it depends on the mother thyroid to go and help during the developmental process. And one of the most important process which require thyroid hormone is during the brain development. So if the mother is hypothyroid and if the thyroxine levels are low, it affects how your neurons maturate, how the neural migration happens, and later in the childhood, what is the IQ. So most of the iodine deficient belt of India, which is generally the hilly areas and area adjoining Nepal, so they have a condition which is known as cretinism. So the kids which are born there are born of the mothers which have less thyroid hormone develop cretinism. So IQ is less than 20. So they are cretins, they're mentally retarded, and also it affects the size of the children. So thyroid hormone also affect the growth. So you have a growth retardation along with mental retardation. So this is why thyroxine is quite important and especially very important during pregnancy. So these are the this how the iodine deficiency results in goiter formation. So the thyroid gland, because when you have less iodine in your food and salt, the thyroid gland try to make up for that by increasing in size so that it can collect more and more iodine. So that's why you have a goiter. So you have a swelling here you can see the swelling in the near the throat region. So this is a classical example of iodine deficiency, which results in severe hypothyroidism. Now, another important hormone is the parathyroid hormone. Now, this is just located near the thyroid gland, and its function is to control the metabolism of calcium. So now, because calcium homeostasis is very much needed during growth in maintaining bone health. So if the calcium is not well regulated, you have weak bones and teeth. So this hormone secreted by parathyroid gland is called parathyroid hormone or parathormone. So under secretion of parathyroid hormone results in nerve disorder, brittle bones, and clotting problem. So how does parathyroid hormone works is that it sends the decrease in the serum calcium levels. So when the parathyroid gland sends there is less circulating calcium, it secretes parathyroid hormone, which acts on a bone for to release some calcium from the bone. This is called bone desorption. So in this way, you can increase the serum calcium levels. At the same time, parathyroid hormone also act on the kidney to increase the production of vitamin D, which is very important to enhance calcium absorption from the intestine. So that's how the parathyroid hormone help in maintaining calcium homeostasis in our body. And another important hormone is the adrenal gland. So this is located in the near the kidney upper regions, the kidney heads. So this hormone, these are the hormones called the two hormones secreted by adrenal glands are called cortisol and adrenaline. So most of you have must have known about steroids. So these are the naturally produced steroids in our body, and adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, is the one which is famously known as the flight or fight hormone. So it is acutely produced in cases of stress, and it's a very fast acting hormone to affect your response to stress. So function of cortisol is to regulate carbohydrate, protein, and fat metabolism. So it promotes conversion of fats and protein to glucose. That's why steroids generally cause increase in blood sugar levels, and they have important function in making muscle mass. So artificial steroids are taken by bodybuilders to make muscle mass, and this is the naturally produced steroids, which also glucocorticoids. Now, function of adrenal is to raise blood sugar level and increase heartbeat and breathing rates. So this is generally increase in response to increased physical stress or demand for high energy expenditure, like while running or while having vigorous sports activity. So under secretion of adrenaline results in inability to deal with stress. So it's so you can see what happens when you don't have adrenaline. You're always in a dull mood, and you cannot cope up with stress. Okay. Now this is the most of you must have heard about this. This is the Islet of Langerhans, and they produce one of the most important hormone, one which is the most poster boy hormone of endocrine system is called insulin. So located these are located in the pancreas, and hormones secreted are insulin and glucagon. So there's not exclusive list. There are other hormones which are also secreted, but I'll touch upon mostly on these two hormones which play an important role in the carbohydrate metabolism. So insulin, as we all know, stimulate glucose uptake by the cells, and glucagon acts as an antagonist hormone to insulin, and it's promote conversion of glycogen into glucose. So where insulin increase glucose production, it decrease glucose production and increase glucose consumption. Glucagon increases glucose level in the body. So it's just opposite to insulin. So how is blood sugar regulated by the action of these two hormones? So the oversecretion of insulin results in low blood sugar, and undersecretion of insulin results in high blood sugar. This can lead to the this lead to a condition which is famously known as diabetes. So apart from these classical endocrine glands, there are also some non-classical endocrine glands. So the list is increasing. So these are some of the very well-known endocrine glands. But now we know that other organs in our body also produce hormone, and they come into the category of endocrine hormones because they are directly released into the blood. So important one is the hypothalamus. So even though pituitary is the master endocrine gland, even pituitary is under the control of this gland, which is called hypothalamus, and it's a part of basically the brain. So it has neurons, which it's a both part of the. So it is a very good amalgamation of a neuroendocrine system. So the hormones are the one which regulate the endocrine systems. So hypothalamus secretes some of the major hormones like TRH, which regulate the production of TSH in the pituitary. And similarly, other pituitary regulating hormones are also under the control of hypothalamus. Apart from hypothalamus, the heart also produces a lot of hormone which regulate various aspects of contraction and relaxation in heart. Kidney produces renin, which regulate the blood pressure system, which is the renin angiotensin system, and also vitamin D, which is also considered as a hormone. Now, liver also produces hormones. One of the most famous is the IGF-1, which is called insulin-like growth factor hormone, and it acts just like insulin. The pathways are the same, and also affect glucose metabolism and growth. And gut, intestine also produce hormones. The two of the most famous one are the GLP-1 and GIP. Placenta is another important organ which also has endocrine aspects, and it also produces a lot of hormone which affect the placental growth and also affect the well-being of the fetus. Pineal gland produce melatonin, which is important in regulating the circadian rhythms, and bone produce another hormone or a growth factor known as FGF23. And very importantly, adipose tissue, which were considered inert and only as organs to store lipids, are actually quite metabolically active and produce two major hormones known as leptin and adiponectin, which affects our food intake and lipid metabolism. Now, how does the endocrine system work? So endocrine system, you have to admire that it's a very tightly regulated system. So because we know that you have seen what happens when you have an over secretion or under secretion of hormones. But even if you don't have a gland which is secreting a lot of hormone, it is under the hormone levels itself should be quite tightly regulated. So there is a feedback mechanism system so that the body tells the endocrine gland to either stop or produce more. So it's a very good feedback mechanism which happens. So there are two types of feedback mechanism. One is the positive feedback, and another is a negative feedback. Now this is the input. So this is the endocrine hormone acting on the system. Process is any process which could be development, metabolism, pregnancy, anything. And this these are the tissues which are being affected, and then the output is what is the effect of that endocrine hormone action on the process. Now the output, if it increases more than what is needed, it sends a auto cutoff signal to the input. So the tissue which is the primary responder of the hormones has a mechanism to tell the initial hormone producing gland to stop producing if the process is out of control. So this is called feedback. Now this can increase the further production, which is called positive feedback, or inhibit the production of the hormone, which is called negative feedback. Mostly it's a negative feedback which is very important in endocrine homeostasis. So what is the negative feedback mechanism? So you can consider as analogous to a thermostat in a home. So you know that when as the temperature cools, the thermostat detects the change and trigger the furnace to turn on and warm the house. So and it's actually very similar to what we have the air conditioners. So we set a temperature. If the temperature is going way below that set point, then your air conditioner stops. So there is an auto cutoff system based on the process which is meant to be regulated by that instrument. In the same way, hormones also are under the regulation of the process which they regulate. So once that a very good example is the blood sugar level. So body sugar increases after a meal, so the pancreas secrete insulin, which tells the body cells to take in glucose. But when the blood sugar levels reaches normal, the pancreas stop making insulin. So the glucose, which is the end product of the action of insulin itself, is a trigger to tell the endocrine cells of the pancreas to stop insulin when the levels are stabilized. So this is called a negative feedback. Another very classical example of negative feedback in endocrine system is the hypothalamic-pituitary-thyroid axis. Now, we all know when we see a thyroid report of anyone, we see that the TSH is either up or low. Now, if the TSH level go down, it means that you are hyperthyroid. The reason is that when your T3, T4 production by thyroid increases, it has a negative regulation on the pituitary to stop the production of TSH. And the same way, it also gives a negative feedback on the hypothalamic TRH production. So this is a classical negative feedback in which if the end organ hormones are in excess, to stop further increase in their production, they tell the master hormones endocrine organ like pituitary and hypothalamus to stop producing their hormones, which in turn affect the production of the effector organs. So the TSH is under the regulation of T4 and T3. So the more of your T3, T4 production, the less will be the TSH. And this is how your homeostasis is maintained. If your T3, T4 level go down because of any reason, then more and more TSH will be produced by the pituitary to compensate for that decrease. And this is how the endocrine system works in a very homeostatic manner. Another way in which homeostasis is maintained in the endocrine system is through the regulating the number of receptors. So when the ligand or the hormone increases well beyond what is needed for normal physiology, the receptor actually are either desensitized or they go down in expression levels. So this is very classical example is the insulin receptor in the liver. So when there is excess of insulin, there is a process known as insulin resistance, which happens when the receptor itself goes down. So there is a homeostatic response by the target tissue so that it is not hyperactivated by a hormone. So it decreases the number of receptor. So the net effect on the tissue is decreased. And another way of positive regulation could be an upregulation. So when the hormone levels decrease, then you upregulate the receptor so that you can catch even the low amount of hormone in the circulation. So this is called upregulation of receptor to compensate for decrease in hormone, and the upper one is the downregulation to compensate for an excess in hormone levels. Now, what is the positive feedback? This is quite a not that much seen in the endocrine regulation, but it happens in some cases. The very classical example is the positive feedback mechanism of oxytocin. So what happens is that oxytocin stimulates and enhances labor contraction during childbirth. So as labor contraction increases, more oxytocin is produced. So it's not a negative, it's a positive feedback. And it is generally considered not as a fine-tuning mechanism, but more when the overaction of a hormone doesn't have an adverse effect on the system. So in this case, actually more oxytocin is good because it will help in the childbirth. So more oxytocin is produced, furthermore contraction happens until the baby is outside the birth canal. And oxytocin production stop and labor contraction stop. So as soon as the birth happens, the labor contraction stops, and this gives a signal to the to your endocrine organ in the pituitary that it doesn't need any oxytocin production now. So this is called a positive feedback mechanism, and it although not very much common in endocrine system, it also helps in some of the very important physiological processes. Now let's discuss more on what are the different classes of hormones. So there are basically three types of hormones in our body. So one is the peptide hormones. So it's the nature, it's the backbone of the macromolecule which make them. So they can be peptide, they could be amines, or they could be steroids. Now, how is the peptide hormone formed? The precursor is actually a specific gene which directs the mRNA. So for every peptide hormone, you have a gene which code for that hormone. Example is glucagon, example is insulin, example is growth hormone. Okay, and for amines, there's the simplest one. It's just an amino acid which is modified In case of thyroid, it is modified by iodine. Okay, and adrenal is also example of a amine. No, catecholamine is also an example of an amine. So these are just modification in the amino acid. The steroids are not coded by a gene. They are actually modified from the cholesterol backbone. Okay, so you cannot knock out a steroid producing gene, because there's no gene producing steroid. They are just modification of cholesterol, whereas it is possible to totally remove a gene encoding for insulin. Okay, so peptide hormone, it is possible for us to knock them down. Now, side of synthesis. For peptide hormone, they are generally ribosome, ER, and Golgi, because they are proteins or peptides. So the assembly is generally at the ribosomal rough ER membrane. For amines, it is a totally enzymatic reaction, and it happens at different location, mostly in the cytosol, where in the thyroid wall, it's for follicular cells, where you synthesize T4 and T3 from iodination process. And cholesterol derived steroid hormones are synthesized in cytosol, ER, or mitochondria, wherever the lipid metabolism or cholesterol metabolism can occur. Peptide hormones are stored in forms of precursor molecules, like you have a pre-proinsulin, and so you have a precursor insulin which is cleaved by a different enzyme to make it a mature. Okay, so they are stored in granules, and upon stimuli they are released. The similar thing happen also in amines. They are also stored in granules, like for thyroid, it's stored in follicular cells. But for steroids, they are not stored in granules. The synthesis and release upon stimulation happens, and they are not stored in secretory granules. So this is a major difference between different type of hormones. And the nature of this hormone will also tell you how they are going to act in the cell. So first, let's come to the peptide hormone. So the peptide hormone do not enter the cell directly because they are hydrophilic. So these hormones bind to receptor proteins in the cell membrane. So if you remember yesterday's class, I talked about G-coupled receptors and tyrosine kinase receptors. So these are the two major receptors which are responsible for mediation of the action of these peptide hormones. So when the hormone binds, is my voice audible to everyone? Arinam is saying it's not coming. So is it fine?
Yes, sir, it's fine.
Okay. Okay, so when the hormone binds with the receptor protein, a secondary messenger molecule initiate the cell response. So that's what I taught you yesterday, that how the signal transduction happen in response to G-coupled receptors and tyrosine kinase receptor. And one of the very important thing you have to understand in the kinetics of hormone action is that mostly the peptide hormones are the most fastest acting hormones. So because they work on the membrane receptor, they generally do not affect they're not dependent on gene expression changes to a large extent. They are quite fast in acting. So you cannot wait for an insulin to take hours to regulate your glucose level. So you need it within minutes. Okay, so that's how the nature had designed these peptide hormones. So they act through the G-coupled receptors or the tyrosine kinase receptor, and they work on fast kinetics. It's a sequence of phosphorylation events, and within minutes you can see the effect of that hormones. So this is very important for peptide hormones, and this is very much unlike what steroid hormones do. So I'll come to that slowly. So okay, so this is this again a repetition of yesterday's talk. So this is actually for people who had missed yesterday's one. So this is how it all happens in case of peptide hormone. So the first, the hormone bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane of the target cell, then it initiate a cascade of signal transduction events, which either results in the synthesis of secondary messenger known as cyclic AMP, or through the tyrosine kinase receptor action, it helps in phosphorylation of different kinases. So when the cyclic AMP, in this case, when the cyclic AMP is made, it activates kinases like protein kinase A, which in turn affects different catalytic activities in the cells, and the things move quite fast from there on. Okay. This is an example of how insulin work. So insulin works through the tyrosine receptor kinases. So it binds to the tyrosine receptor kinase. There's the autophosphorylation of the tyrosine, which increase the phosphorylation of insulin related substrate 1, IRS1, which in turn activate a cascade of signaling which culminate in the phosphorylation of this protein known as AKT. Most of you must have heard about this famous protein AKT, which in turn affects cellular process of either changes in the cytoskeleton system or affecting the glucose metabolism. In this case, what this picture is showing that in response to insulin, there is an increased translocation of glucose transporter to the membrane. So one of the important things which insulin has done is that it tells your muscle cell or a liver cells to take up as much as glucose as possible, because it doesn't want glucose to be in the blood. So all organs are instructed by insulin to take up glucose. In case of liver, it could be stored as glycogen, and muscle can just do the glycolysis and finish that glucose off. So for that, you need a very fast translocation of this receptor glucose transporter to the membrane, and this is brought about by the fast acting insulin signaling, and it happens within minutes. Okay, so this is how this signaling happens. So I won't go into the amine, how the amines work, but I'll tell you the amine forms of hormones, which I talked. The second category can work both as like steroid hormone signaling pathway, and can also go through the peptide hormone. It depends. For example, thyroid hormone, which is also amine derived hormone, work and exactly follows the steroid hormone pathway of signal transduction, whereas catecholamine follow more of the peptide hormone pathways. So let's talk about steroid hormones. So steroid hormones enter through the cell membrane and bind to receptor inside the target cells. So these hormones may directly stimulate transcription of the genes to make certain proteins. And because steroid work by triggering gene activity, the response is slower than peptide hormone. So because they work primarily not by generating secondary messenger, but by directly binding to the receptor, which affect DNA replication and transcription. So they are time-taking processes, because once the receptor bind to the DNA, then it will recruit the RNA polymerase, then slowly the transcription will start, then finally the translation will happen, and then you'll get the product of the protein, which is supposed to do what the steroid hormone wants the cells to do. Okay, so this whole process may take from minutes to hours. So they are generally short-lived, long executed processes, but because they rely on protein synthesis, they are quite long-lasting. So unlike peptide hormone action, which is fast live and quick die method, so you have secondary messengers which are degraded within minutes also. So their effects is not very long-lasting, whereas steroid hormone effects are quite long-lasting. So once you have RNA synthesized, it can remain there for many hours, and it can keep on translating protein. So it takes time for steroids to work, but they can sustain it for much longer time. Okay, so this is how the steroid hormone work. So steroid hormone, it could be the sex hormones like estrogen, it could be testosterone, and thyroid hormone also work through the same way. So all these sex hormones and other classes of steroid hormones first go inside the cell, because they're hydrophobic, they can pass through the membrane. Then either they bind to the receptor which is in the cytosol, or they bind to the receptor which is inside the nucleus. So you have to understand they bind to the receptor which also have a DNA binding motif. So they are basically transcription factors. So the steroid family hormones bind to transcription factors, and once the transcription factor bind to this ligand, which is a steroid, there is a conformation change, and it can bind to the DNA now. Now once it binds to the DNA, it can affect the activity of RNA polymerase. You have mRNA synthesis, and then you get a protein, which could be an enzyme which affects the cellular function. Okay, so this is how the steroid receptors and hormones work. Now, this slide shows you the arrangement of a nuclear receptor, like a nuclear hormone receptor. So at the N terminal, there is a DNA binding domain. Then at the C terminal, there is a ligand binding domain. Ligand is basically the steroid hormone. Okay, and this is the DNA binding motif. Now, there are different ways in which steroid hormone works. So there are basically 4 types of ways in which steroid hormone receptor interaction happens and how they affect gene expression. So first is the class type 1, in which the ligand comes and bind to a receptor which is in the cytosol, as I've shown. So estrogen works like that. Estrogen binds to a receptor which is in the cytosol, and upon binding to the ligand, this receptor goes inside the nucleus and bind to a specific sequence of nucleotide. These are called hormone responsive sites, okay, or hormone responsive elements. So there's a sequence of nucleotide which spans your target gene promoter, where these receptors are meant to bind. So these are hormone responsive elements. Now they can bind as a homodimer, okay, so they dimerize with the same class of receptor, or they can bind as a heterodimer, that two different nuclear receptors can bind. So type 2 is where the ligand goes inside the nucleus first, and then it binds to already DNA bound receptor. So it's different from the first type, in which the receptor translocate upon binding to the ligand. In this case, the receptor already is on the DNA waiting for the ligand to come, and as soon as the ligand comes, it causes a shuttling of cofactor. Now, what are the cofactors? So cofactors are generally it is like a hub of proteins known as co-repressors or co-activators. Now, you must have heard about epigenetics and histone modification. Now, histone modification is done by a group of enzymes known as HATs and HDACs. So what HATs do is that they acetylate the DNA. So when you have an acetylation of DNA, the negative charge goes off and the nucleosomes open. And as soon as the nucleosome open, the polymerase can bind to the promoter Tata box, and then the transcription can start. Whereas co-repressors recruit a class of enzyme known as HDACs, which is called histone deacetylase. So they remove the acetyl group, so the negative charge increase. So in that case, the DNA, the histones bind the DNA, and the DNA, the promoter region is not accessible to the RNA polymerase. So what the ligand does is that it, as soon as it binds to the your receptor here, nuclear receptor, let me use the laser. So as soon as the ligand binds here, so it changes the conformation of the receptor, so as the co-repressor bound to the receptor is released and a co-activator instead bind to this. So you have to understand, under non-bound state, when the receptor, nuclear receptor, is not bound to the ligand, it recruits co-repressor because it is meant to stop the gene expression. Okay, it's like your on and off switch. So by default it is off. As soon as the ligand comes, it switches to on mode. So when on mode has to happen, there's a change in the conformation of the receptor when the ligand is there, and it releases co-repressor and recruits co-activator. That's how it works. The type 3 is similar to type 2. The ligand comes inside the nucleus, but unlike type 2, when you have two different type of nuclear receptors, which is the heterodimer, you have a homodimer here. So it's the same. So homodimer, heterodimer, I can explain you something like, you have a PPAR. You have heard about PPAR nuclear receptor, and also ER, and also thyroid hormone receptor. So sometimes these receptors bind to each other, so they can they have mutual binding domains, and one of the most common one is the RXR receptor. So these are all hormone sensitive receptors, but they can bind to another receptor of a different hormone reception. So when two different receptor bind in response to a hormone on a DNA, that's called heterodimer. And when the same class of receptor binds, it's called homodimer. Like estrogen binding to another estrogen receptor in response is homodimer, and estrogen binding to a RXR receptor in response to ligand is called a heterodimer formation. So in this case, it is the same thing, but it's a homodimer. Okay, and these are the hormone responsive site. And the this is the fourth one. So the fourth one is, instead of dimerizing, it exists as a monomer, and the concept is the same. Co-repressor is released upon binding and co-activators are included. So that's how the nuclear receptor works and the gene expression. Okay. So this is a much more comprehensive picture to show you what I was telling you before, that this is a co-repressor complex. So this is actually a collection of proteins which have inherent HDAC activities. So I've shown you is histone, and these are the so this is, you can see, this is example of a heterodimer. So it's a PPAR gamma, which is a class of nuclear receptor. It is in bound state along with another nuclear receptor. This is RXR. This is the heterodimer binding in response to ligand. So as soon as the ligand, as soon as the ligand comes, this as co-repressor complex, which has the HTAG activity, is released. Okay, and a co-activator come here. So this co-activator possesses a HAT activity, which is a histone acetylase activity. So it acetylases the histone. So the nucleosomes are released, the DNA is open, chromatin is in open state, and then you can start the transcription. So this is how it happens. Okay. Now, so coming to the conclusion. So the take-home message from this presentation is that hormones are released in bloodstream to execute a specific physiological action in multicellular organisms. Endocrine hormones have a homeostatic auto cutoff mechanism. So they have a very good auto cutoff mechanism so that the physiology doesn't go haywire. Water soluble peptide hormones act via membrane receptors and mostly fast acting. Hydrophobic steroid hormones act via nuclear receptors and take time to act. And ligand dependent exchange of nuclear cofactor mediate hormone action of gene expression. Okay, so by this, I think you have a clear picture of how hormones act and how the different classes of hormones have. And so from tomorrow, we'll start more on the metabolism. So how these hormones affect different type of metabolism. So we'll go through the glucose metabolism and the lipid metabolism and the diseases associated with them. And in the other slides, we'll also cover on some of the aspect of hormone dependent cancer progression, and finally on most of the current therapies for metabolic diseases. So with this, we'll finish it, and if you have any other questions, please ask.